Everyone, I'm Wesley Sarmento. I'm a Blackfeet descendant, wildlife biologist, and board member for Glacier-Two Medicine Alliance. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce Whisper Camel-Means, who I've actually known for over a decade now. She is an impressive wildlife biologist, and she's worked for the Salish Kootenai tribes as the Division of Fish, Wildlife, and Recreation and Conservation Program Manager. She started her career with the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe as a wildlife biologist trainee in 1997 while studying environmental studies at the Salish Kootenai College in Pablo, Montana. She then transferred to the University of Montana in Missoula, where she earned a Bachelor's of Science degree in wildlife biology. From there, she attended Montana State University in Bozeman to pursue her Master's of Science degree in Fish and Wildlife Management. She was awarded a fellowship from the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Western Transportation Institute to conduct her master's work on United States Highway 93 pre-construction wildlife movements. While in Bozeman, she was employed by the Western Transportation Institute to participate in other highway and wildlife-related projects, including animal detection system prototype projects in Yellowstone National Park, as well as wildlife warning systems in Bozeman Pass. Upon completing her master's program, she returned to the Flathead Indian Reservation to continue working with the Salish Kootenai tribe in their wildlife management program. Her current duties include U.S. Highway 93 post-construction wildlife monitoring and mitigation tools that have been implemented as a part of the reconstruction project. Outreach and education to reservation youth and the adult community members is an important part of our job in protecting wildlife. Whisper is one of 7 founding members of Psi Nation on the Flathead Indian Reservation, bringing science, technology, and engineering and math to the reservation youth and helping to inspire the next generation of scientists and land stewards. And I really think that Whisper's work was really some of the important stuff that was put in place to help with all those wildlife crossings on the Flathead Indian Reservation. So she's been integral in the conservation of migrations and wildlife movements in that area. So it's my pleasure to introduce her.
Thanks, everybody. I'm gonna try to walk around because I'm kind of a walker when I talk, and so sounds like this is gonna work. Thank you very much. And thank you, Wesley, for the introduction. When I first met him, I remember telling the other biologists, I think it was at a TWS conference, and I said, I met this really dynamic guy who's working for the Blackfeet, and I'm really impressed with him, and I think that's going to be a really good deal, and I hope that he goes far. So I'm glad that you're still doing research up there. Good morning, everybody. My name is Whisper Camel-Means. I'm an enrolled member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. I am Kalispay, which is one of the 3 tribes that are present there. And thank you very much for having me here this morning. I hope we're not too strict on that schedule, but I'm gonna try to keep it as tight as I can here. And I've worked for the Confederated tribes for a long time, and I'm really excited to be here and to kind of give you my perspective on the work that I've done over time. And really kind of setting in that connection that tribal people have with the landscape. And we really think about that holistic connection. Historically, we had to live off the land and really closely, and it resulted in that relationship of reciprocity. And so the way that we manage today, and we think about wildlife and water and fish and the landscapes, all are connected and rooted in that. And as you see, as I go through this presentation, how those things still really function and do the things that we do today. Starting with this map from the state of Montana, and it only encompasses the state. It doesn't talk about historical territories in Canada or Idaho, Wyoming, really just focusing on the state of Montana. The Office of Public Instruction put this out a few years ago, and I love it because it's a good depiction. And it shows some of those historical territories. It shows where we're talking about today, the Flathead Reservation. And the thing that makes some of the distinctions between the tribes and how we manage land is the treaties and the language therein. The Stevens Treaty of 1855, which is what the Salish, the Bitterroot Salish, the Kalispé, and the Kasanka people negotiated, is the last, other than the Common Hunting Grounds, Stevens Treaty that was negotiated that year. And so the relationship with the language in that treaty really comes straight from the West Coast. The Yakima have the exact same language in their treaty. They're pretty much to a T. And so the language in that treaty, the way it was written, really had to do a lot with fishing and hunting and that type of thing, where the Fort Laramie treaties that were negotiated with the rest of the state of Montana, the language really came from the Dakotas and had a lot more to do with a pastoral way of life, about having a ranch and having land and grazing cattle. And that has a direct relationship to what we do today, because the fundamental language in that treaty allows us to have federal funding to be able to manage fish and wildlife on our reservation. Oh, sorry, this one keeps hiding. I was somewhere else and I wanted to show people where we were. We have 1.25 million acres in what I kind of refer to as the boot. It's a little bit of a boot-shaped reservation. And we really span a lot of different habitat types. We've got mountains to the east and the west and the south. We've got half of Flathead Lake. We have a fertile valley that was carved out by glaciers. There are pothole waters. The lower Flathead River flowing right through the middle of the reservation, the western side of the reservation being very arid and having less rainfall per year, and just a lot of people living in the eastern side. And of course, we got Missoula just to the south of us. One thing that we take really seriously is our tribal sovereignty. And in the 1930s, CSKT was one of the tribes that quickly wrote a constitution when the Indian Reorganization Act came through. And so that's another basis for a lot of the things that govern what the government does there. And that we are a domestic dependent nation, and that we govern ourselves, we define our membership, we manage our tribal property and lands, and that we have that government-to-government relationship with the tribes as well as the state of Montana, and we exercise that quite frequently. I talked to some of the folks in our legal department, and they say that a lot of the fights that we fight today are really based on the reservation being opened up to homesteading, and it was really a detrimental era to the tribes. It fundamentally changed our lifeways, our economy, and our autonomy. And so I really like to show this little animation that I created. But when that treaty was negotiated, and previous to that, Western Montana was part of our territory, and so on our land status map, tribal land is green. And as we were starting to come into the early 1900s, and they started to set up Indian agents on the reservation, they were starting to look toward the future and what people were coming to Montana, and said, well, we better get all these tribal people an allotment, have them start to have property, get them to invest in building up their little home sites. But historically, the way we lived, family groups lived in little groups around the reservation. We hunted and we harvested plants and we lived together and we took care of ourselves in small groups. But now we were being told, well, spread out, and people still did get their little home sites in those groups of places where they all lived. But we started to spread out and started to become responsible for a small plot of land. But for people that didn't understand that lifeway, it was difficult. And to put value on that land wasn't quite solidified. So we got the properties, and I think part of this all, and I haven't totally delved into the Flathead Irrigation Project and how much of a political situation that was as well. Because once you get everybody to get their property and you're supposed to be growing crops and you're supposed to be having livestock, there was the need to spend money to create this very large irrigation project that is still in place today and still has a lot of environmental ramifications. So once all the tribal people were told, we got your allotment, you're set, now all the rest of that land is surplus land. We're gonna go ahead and open that up to homesteading. And so a lot of people came to the area and were able to purchase property quite cheaply, and it really started to further change the dynamics of the people living on the reservation, but also increasing conflicts. And we had another round of allotments, really trying to solidify people. One of the sad stories I guess I've heard a lot is you could see a lot of allotments around Flathead Lake and around the shores. And as people would go to the grocery stores back then and charge food bills, and when those food bills would come due, the store owners would say, you can give me that deed for your land or that property and we'll wipe your bill clear. And so people did. They said, I don't know, I'll just go stay with my family somewhere else, and gave up their land around the lake. And as you can see here, the buff colored is that fee land, which is non-tribal land, and a lot of that around the lake is no longer tribal land. So that was just a really hard time, and I need to work on my animation because this one doesn't smoothly fit, but I've changed from the purple circle in the middle, which was the National Bison Range, to green tribal land, which is the CSKT Bison Range, as we've had that restored. And I would love to give you a whole presentation about the Bison Range, because along with fish, wildlife, recreation, and conservation, I also oversee the Bison Range and our aquatic invasive species surveillance station. So we have a pretty big biological and recreational resources program division that I oversee. So those changes really affect, we're at about 62% ownership, land ownership now, and that's different things. So we have the forested areas, we have the Bison Range, we have tribal land that's held for different types of purposes, and we'll get into that in a second. So back to that Hellgate Treaty. Article 3 is what oversees a lot of what I do in my daily work. And that is that there's language that talks about the exclusive right of taking fish in all streams running through or bordering the reservation in usual and accustomed places. It has direct ramifications on the water compact that you might have heard of that has been approved for the Flathead Reservation. It also relates to federal funding for our fisheries programs. So we were able to compact those programs over from the federal government in the 1980s so that tribal people could manage them with federal dollars. We also have the privilege to hunt and gather on open and unclaimed land. That's generally referenced to federal lands around the reservation and includes that hunt word, though some of those rights have not been solidified as fully as fishing has on the reservation. And then in Article 3, which is talking about fishing and wildlife, it also talks about roads. And it talks about keeping roads open through the reservation. The language is in the treaty. It says the people in common with the citizens of the United States will be able to travel on all public highways. I wrote no tolls because it includes free access through those roads. And so I've heard people say, well, why don't we just set up a toll booth on either end of the reservation? Because we are a major tourism thoroughfare, right? From I-90 all the way up to Glacier in Canada. So the treaty says it has to be free, it has to be open, no tolls. So in that treaty, in that article of the treaty, we hit the fishing and wildlife as well as the highways and the keeping that area open for the people in the territory. But through our Constitution and different ordinances, we have exerted our tribal sovereignty and created regulations for our tribal members for hunting and fishing, as well as non-members through an agreement with the state of Montana called the State Tribal Fish and Wildlife Agreement, where we have a joint license for fishing and hunting, so that when you come on the Flathead Reservation, you don't have to pay for one license to recreate on tribal land and a separate license to hunt or fish on state land, which it used to be. And that was litigated, almost. It went to litigation, and we were told with the state, figure this out so that we don't have to go all this way. And so far, we've done a really good job of working with the state, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to really be able to execute that. So we have a natural and cultural resource hierarchy. We have a tribal council that is 10 members that are elected from tribal members around the reservation. And then under the tribal council, we have 2 separate culture committees. We have the Salish Kalispé, which are one culture committee because historically, language group was the same. A lot of their lifeways and customs were similar as Salishan speaking people, but they weren't the same tribe. We lived separately. The Bitterroot Salish were down in the Bitterroot, or what I call the nose of the state of Montana, because it looks like a nose. And so that's where the Bitterroot Salish people lived. And then the Kasanka, who were on the northern edge of the reservation, they have more of an Athabascan language group, and it's separate, completely separate and different sounding and looking than the Salish language. So we have 2 separate culture committees that oversee what we do on the reservation. When we have a project or a new thing that we want to propose to do, we have to go to the culture committees to get feedback before we go to the tribal council to get approval to do things. And then in our division, not just my division, a couple above me, we have the Natural Resource Department, we have Historic Preservation, which is like the TIPO office, we've got our forestry and all the trust resources that they oversee, as well as the Lands Department that oversees commercial and some recreation lands. But in the Natural Resource Department, we have 3 different divisions. Mine, which is Fish and Wildlife. We have Water Quality, which deals with anything EPA driven that addresses water quality, browns fields, underground leaky storage tanks, any kind of EPA driven tribal program is under them. And we have Water Measurement, which kind of relates to the water compact and the irrigation program, but also includes our roads department, or our roads program. So for us, we've got the fisheries that oversees the lake and lake trout suppression, wildlife. I put a picture of fire because we do a lot of habitat work and land management, and fire is such an important part of that. Outdoor recreation. We're really working hard to get kids back in the woods, right? Like you guys know, it's really a hard time, and trying to get people confident to go back in the woods, to go in the woods at all. I think that maybe that's a challenge sometimes, and getting kids excited about that again. Game wardens, we oversee law enforcement that enforce our ordinance, and they are cross-deputized with the state of Montana under that agreement. We've got the bison range, which we're excited about. And one of the big changes that we made was to turn the museum over into our story, because the story that was being told by the Fish and Wildlife Service staff there at the time had chosen to tell sort of a skewed story that wasn't really accurate and used our tribal people's names in a way that wasn't the right story. And so one of the first things we did when we took over was to wipe that slate clean, get our culture committees to come in and help us to tell the right story and get that out to everybody. So that's what we do. We have our language in the visitor center. I think that's one of the things that makes me excited about restoration, bison restoration across the state of Montana, is that all the tribes are working on that. And for everybody to be able to use their language to represent bison and other wildlife on their lands is really an important part about acknowledging where you are. And previously, kind of called it Dances with Wolves, because the language that was being used in the bison range was Sioux. It was the Sioux language. And when we would try to say, why don't you use our language? They said, no, we're good. People recognize these words because of the movie Dances with Wolves. You know, I appreciate and respect the Sioux, and their language on their land is an appropriate place. And aquatic invasive species, man, up here on the north end, right, you guys have a station in Browning. This is such a huge issue. I'm not even controversial to say this. I wish that we would stop allowing outside of the state of Montana boats to come into the state. I wish we just empowered state businesses to rent boats, and people could just rent their boats here, because it is so inevitable, because people act really rude at those stations. It is shocking how entitled people are, and then they end up having water in their live wells and mussels, and it's just frustrating. So I wish the state would just block outside boats and we could just preserve the flathead. And then outreach and education, we're always outreaching to kids. I feel like, and it was in my bio, we did a really good job of wildlife outreach and not so much fisheries, and we have a lot of aspiring wildlife biologists. Everybody wants to be a wildlifer. We're like, okay, but what about fish? This map shows wild protected areas. Some of those are cultural protected, some of those are protected, most of them for wildlife. So everything that you see in color here is mostly protected by the tribes. Some of the orange in the middle is other agencies. I need to get an updated map that doesn't show the bison range as an other agency, but we've got elk and bighorn sheep conservation areas. We've got a grizzly bear management area that's closed currently until October 15th. The purple at the north and south end of the reservation are for tribal members only. And just a lot of mitigation properties that we purchased for past environmental degradation. So the dam has mitigation. The previous dam owners managed the lower Flathead River for energy demands further down the system. So there used to be a sign that says, if the horn honks 3 times, get out of there, because we're opening up the gates and the water's coming down. And it scoured the edges of the river. We had no beaver dams, we have no cottonwoods or early succession plants. The dam management really impacted the lower Flathead River. So we were able to sue and get mitigation for that. We've got ARCO mitigation. Anything that was pollution in the past, the state of Montana growing to where it was has a legacy of some of that, and we had some funds to repair some of those damages. We've got approximately 17,000 acres of protected property just for those things, wildlife and culture. And so when we talk about Highway 93, when I talk about Highway 93, and the moniker that it was given early on was the People's Way Highway. And that had a couple of reasons. One, because they were engaging a lot of people to talk about it. But also one of the Salish words for the trail that kind of went down to Missoula was the People's Way. And so it has a history or a root in a tribal word for the path that led all the way down there. So that's really what started becoming how we talked about it. And when Montana Department of Transportation, I'll refer to as MDT, and the CSKT had initially started talking about that road, it was a narrow 2-lane road with barely any shoulders. And people were dying like crazy there. Head-on collisions, animal vehicle collisions. It was just a dangerous place. And right, we can envision it because Highway 2 is the same kind of thing, very narrow. People get frustrated. Yesterday when I was driving over here and there's a slow vehicle and I'm just like, I hope nobody passes because there's gonna be a car coming. It was the same kind of thing there. And so we started talking about what needed to happen. MDT said, we are proposing a 4-lane divided highway through the middle of the reservation. The level of service for this highway calls for it, and we need this big interstate through the middle of the reservation, and they cited human safety, which is totally understandable. We move goods and services and people, tourists and daily commuters up and down that road. And so we understood that, but we felt like a divided 4-lane highway through the entire heart of the Flathead Reservation would really impact the small communities that the highway went through, the wildlife that were trying to cross the highway, and really we wanted to advocate for spirit of place. And the spirit of place is just, in landscape ecology terms, that flow of energy across the landscape, the movement of water, the movement of pollen, the movement of bugs and wildlife, everything across the landscape. That is the spirit of place. And so we advocated for that as we went through. And because we had already established our treatment estate through our air quality program, we really came at the state and said, you need to negotiate with us. You cannot come there and tell us what you're going to do. You have to talk to us. And so we really put up a fight on that. And it led to a lot of negotiations. The Federal Highway Administration stepped in, the tribes were at the table, and the Department of Transportation. As a federal agency, the Federal Highway Administration has a special trust responsibility to tribes to try to advocate for us. And so we talked about goals for this project. We wanted the highway the development to be understanding of the land and the relationship of our people with that land. We wanted to find ways that the road could be shaped by the topography of the land. I know this picture is probably a little bit hard to see, but right down here you can see we have one of the potholes in the 9-pipe area. And you know, the 1950s highway that came through just plowed through everything in a straight line, where previously the highway, you can see it, it's hard, I know it's at the bottom, the highway used to go around that pothole. They must have had a lot of fill material in the 1950s, because everything I've seen with highways now is fill material is precious as gold, and you can't fill in an entire pothole with dirt. It surprised me that there was no culverts under that road. I drive over, it goes through multiple potholes like that, and there is no under road connection. There's no culverts, there's no bridges, it's just fill. And the water stays because of the underground connection of that water and surface water flow. So, thinking about how the topography of the land can influence the road, restoring habitats that had been damaged as it went through, respecting and restoring the way of life of small communities, not just blazing right through town, but having signage. The town of Arlee was able to get some dyed concrete at their crosswalks so that people would visually see that and slow down instead of just flying through as your kids are standing there at the crosswalk trying to get to the store. And just to create a better visitor understanding of the place that the Salish and Kootenai people call our home. Let me see. No, we're not quite there yet. So we have signs, whether you're headed southbound or northbound, that have tribal language on the signs. So everything in the southbound lane as you're headed from Polson to Missoula is in the Kootenai language, and all of the signs from Missoula up toward Polson or Kalispell are in the Salish language. So we had to engage our culture committees and had to make sure that the place name for those areas could be on those signs. You may or may not realize that we get a lot of opposition and hatred for the language being on the signs. I don't know why people care, but there's comments that are made about why do they get to have their language on those signs. They. And so the memorandum of agreement was signed in 2000. Everybody had come together and worked really hard because we knew human safety was an issue. We knew that the wildlife was a big deal, and it included those crossing structures. A big delegation of folks from MDT and the tribes went to Banff and looked at what they were doing. At that time, they were the North American who we looked at for crossing structures. And ground broke in 2002, And I put on here that bonds were sold to fund that construction. So these are things I've learned as we've gone along the way about why things kind of stalled out for a while. Initially in the early 2000s, when they were trying to figure out how to fund this, they sold bonds so that they could pay for the highway, and they just finished paying those off maybe a little bit before COVID, so maybe 7 or 8 years ago. They are reluctant, resistant, won't sell bonds again to fund the highway because then they have to make that yearly payment out of their funds for the whole entire state, and they don't like to do that. But that is an option. And so the red is the 56 miles of US 93 that was part of that reconstruction. The green dots on the left-hand side are the 42 wildlife crossing structures that exist today. That includes 1 overpass and 41 underpasses of varying different sizes that I'll go through. And I don't think I have this animation here, but this section is the part that was the most environmentally sensitive, being the 9-pipe area that required environmental impact statements. That took a long time, that resulted in that section not being funded for construction during the initial time. So as we go through, I'll show you how we're trying to fund those today. So crossing structures can look like different things. This bridge over Mission Creek used to just span the water, and it had riprap, this tight riprap at the edge, and there was really, like, wildlife could walk across it, but it wasn't for that. So when expansion bridges are replacing larger bridges and creating that dry space for wildlife to be able to walk. And of course we have our overpass, and in the Salish language, this is Wihull in Chlechs, which is the animals bridge. I will probably never attempt the Kootenai word. I should probably put that on the slide because it's even longer. It's on the other side. It means the same thing. I'm Salish, so that's the language. I look at this picture and I love it because it's our overpass, and I don't love it because it really feels like a sore thumb to me. And that is partially because when this section was reconstructed in 2010, there were 2 options for the overpass. One was a designed version that the Department of Transportation designed. It was very much more flowed with the landscape. It had a more natural rocky look, the way it was designed and prepared. Or the contractor had the ability to propose a second alternative that could be whatever price less than the designed version. And they chose the less expensive prefab concrete design version, not the one not the one we liked. So I feel like, when we look at overpasses and wildlife moving across the landscape, the accepted idea is that the more they can see as they go across the landscape, the more they're likely to use a crossing structure. So as you're coming up from the south, you can see pretty good, but from the north, it's just a big hill. And we have pictures of animals just kind of standing there looking and then going back into the woods. I don't know an animal's brain totally. We can only extrapolate what we think they might be feeling or doing or acting. But I feel like if it was a little less steep and it could be a little bit more visual, then maybe wildlife would be a little more inclined to use it. They totally use it. We've got moose, grizzly bears, bighorn sheep, mule deer, white-tailed deer, bobcats, all use this structure. But is there a reduction because it isn't very visual? I don't know. I love it, but I don't totally love it. We've got underpasses. You could see that water going through. Previously, there was probably a culvert under the highway to move that water. Most of those were perched or dammed up or whatever previous to reconstruction. So being able to open up that area allows that flow of life across the landscape and allows that water to move through without danger of being stopped up, but also allows for wildlife to use it, and water draws them to those locations. So having water is a benefit for crossing structures. We have small ones that sometimes the topography of the roadway doesn't allow for a big structure, but those trees in the back are the Jocko River, and it's a riparian area, and we know that wildlife are crossing through there. There's also a railroad on the other side. So this is probably for bobcats, skunks, which we really like skunks using crossing structures, not being on the highway, small mammals, lizards, snakes, all those things. We did have adventure scientists. The Center for Large Landscape Design hired them to come do a study on Highway 200 from Dixon down to Perma Bridge. So they had people on bicycles riding on the side of the roads and recording all those things that don't, one, hit your car so the Department of Transportation isn't picking up, two, disappear really quickly. So I don't have all those numbers in my head, but lots of birds, lots of snakes, lots of small things that just turn into nothing really quick that we don't think about because they're not getting recorded, because they don't wreck your car, but there's definitely an impact to those species. So small structures are really important. This is under 3 lanes. Again, it's kind of longer, but you can see on the other side, and there was a spring on one side, so now there's that water connectivity. That might even be bison that we see on the other side. This is next to the bison range. I didn't even notice that. We also have wildlife fencing and jump outs that need to accompany those structures because wildlife will just walk onto the highway right next to it if you don't put some fencing and funnel them over there. We have 8-foot tall wildlife fencing with a 3-foot dig barrier dug at the bottom. You can kind of see it looks a little extra here, and the ground is disturbed out a bit. The idea is that that fence is laid into the ground and buried, so digging animals can't just come up and dig a hole under the fence. Bears, coyotes, whatever, they would dig into the fence and stop them from going right under. Our jump outs, these have been modified a bit as time has gone by. The idea is if an animal, such as a deer, was stuck inside the fenced corridor of the highway, that they would be able to go to an escape ramp and then jump off to the safe side of the road and run away from cars. I know, someday I'll get a animation program and fix that. But this cross fence is intended so if an animal is running up the fence line, it's scared, it's trying to get away from the traffic, that it doesn't just run up and then just keep running and keep going. The cross fence makes them stop and make a decision at that point. Jump off or back toward the cars. Marcel with the Wildlife Western Transportation Institute has been working with MDT to look at the height of those to get more animals to use them. Mule deer were jumped down, white-tailed deer are less likely to jump down based on height. We had some that were 8 feet and some that were 5.5 feet. So they've reduced those all to 5.5 feet. And in some places have put a bar across the top so that an animal like an elk standing at the bottom doesn't look up and think, I can jump that. The bar makes it seem even higher so they don't jump into the highway. One day I was checking these. We had sand tracking beds at the bottom and top where we would go and look at what animals were approaching, and then we would see what was at the bottom. Did they jump down? Did they turn around? More wildlife behavior interpretation. And then we would rake those sand beds out and come back 2 or 3 days later. And one day I saw a black bear running up the fence line. I was on the other side of the highway with my rake and my vest and was getting ready to cross the busy highway. It was summer, there was so much traffic. And that bear was running up the fence line. I was like, oh no, I hope it doesn't run in the road. I hope it doesn't come over here. And it came up to the jump out right across from me, and it hit that cross and it jumped down. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna go get those tracks. I'm gonna put them on my data sheet. I waited for the traffic to lessen so I could run across, because that is one of the most dangerous parts. Cars are traveling very fast. Just as I'm getting ready to step out and run across, that bear pops back up to the top. I don't know if he was just holding on. I don't know if it was a tall one and it was scared, but before I got over there, it popped back up to the top and then kept running down the fence line till it got to the end and then ran off. I was like, oh, I'm so glad I didn't go out there at the wrong time. So, I don't know what the interpretation was there, but that bear did come up the jump out. And we've also got wildlife guards. So in places where we couldn't put a fence, and these can be extrapolated out to county roads where you would never have a fence, is the wildlife cattle guards or wildlife crossing guards. And the idea is that they deter hooved animals from entering, but they are not effective for pod animals. We've seen grizzly bears and black bears walk across them in our cameras. Over on the Flathead Reservation, there's studies going to look at electrifying those so that pod animals won't walk across. But then the challenge becomes, how do you keep those electrified in different seasons? And it's not a perfected situation yet, but dealing with and snow plows, if you just have like wires in the road, will the snow plows rip them up? It's still a challenge for snowy areas. Arizona is able to execute those, but not in places where they have snow. So that is what we have for now. The double cattle guard. Oh, I have an animation. He didn't like it. He ran away. He said no thanks. And that's how they look. It's just a bridge decking. And now some pictures of animals using our crossing structures. We always love to see a picture of a doe with a fawn teaching her baby where to cross safely instead of over the highway. Using the bridges. That's a big, looks like an elk on the overpass. A cow elk using an underpass, which cow elk were really suspicious of the underpasses for a long time. So being able to have those lead cows move the herd through the underpass is an important part. Moose on the overpass. We were getting questions about, well, you've got your cameras out there, are hunters just going up there and shooting those moose on the overpass? We were asked to put live cameras up. We didn't put live cameras up. People know there are moose in the area, so we didn't feel like publishing photos like this was a problem because people already know they're there, and the picture is so far from whenever that one moment was that it was there that we didn't think hunters would be able to just go shoot that animal. But we weren't able to publish moose pictures for a long time because it was a concern. Mountain lions in the daytime. So when we check cameras, we always remind everybody there could be wildlife in here, so make sure you're keeping your eyes open. Bobcats. They're so cute. Coyotes. Fox. So I never saw fox in these cameras forever, and I think it's because they were just running by all the time. I would just get an eye flash streak, and finally I got one where it slowed down. That's at Mission Creek where there is still riprap on the side, and it caught that fox. Black bears. That's at Mission Creek, and it actually did swim the creek. So we know that they will be in the water, but they don't have to be in the water. That's the steep side of the overpass. More vegetation on it now, but it's been hard to get things to grow up there. Grizzly bears in the Mission Valley. We do have a picture of them walking by the overpass, but not one going across. Otters, which we love, right? We don't want them to get hit on the highway. One of our fish biologists said at Post Creek that he saw one day he drove by an otter had a fish in its mouth and came up on the bridge, and the cars came by and it dropped its fish and jumped off the side. And I said, oh, they should be able to get through. Beaver. You gotta love that, right? He's so busy. Badgers. The funny thing about badgers is, again, for quite a few years, all I was getting was badger butts. All I saw was this little animal walking, just lumbering away from the camera, never coming at the camera, never got his face. And one day I opened the camera and you can actually see it, and I love it so much. Great horned owls and bats. So people do ask, are wildlife crossing structures predator traps? Do they hunt there? Does a mountain lion sit and wait for deer to come in, then just eat all the deer? We have not seen that. Research has not shown that. But owls may be a different story. They hunt bats. They eat them. They're one of their prey. Are they hanging out in there? I also had some time when I was opening up the cameras and I saw just something hanging down. And I thought it was like a flannel shirt or something. But then I realized it was owls sitting on my camera eviscerating small mammals right in front of the frame. And we'd go there and find the piles of guts. And we're like, okay, so the owls may be the only predators haunting the crossing structures. Yay, skunks using the crossing structure. So cute and not stinking up our car. And then mountain lions using the jump outs. There's 3 cats in this picture. One's almost at the bottom and the other 2 are on the top. And then mule deer jumping down. So almost in conclusion, some of the last places, the yellow circle with the red line is the last section on that 56 miles of Highway 93 to be reconstructed. The red line extends from Post Creek all the way up into the town of Ronan. The north end of Ronan just finished reconstruction. The rest of the town, as well as everything south of there, is still in the works. So MDT said, we don't have the funding. We're prioritizing other places in the state. You guys aren't bringing money to the table, so we're just going to have to wait until we can get there. And our roads program said, okay, well, we'll start applying for federal funding then. And the state DOT was supportive. They've written letters of support for every single grant we've applied to and have been at the table. But we have been very successful in acquiring funding for the reconstruction of that final section. And so the green section here was our first, I was hoping they spelled it out. It's called NSFLTP, Nationally Significant Federal Lands Transportation Project Grant. That is reconstructing Post Creek, increasing a 500-foot bridge for grizzly bear movements, takes us all the way up almost to the 9 Pipe area. That's been funded. We were awarded a Tribal Wildlife Crossing Structure Pilot Project grant for an overpass and multiple underpasses in one of those big potholes so that we can provide those big culverts so muskrats and ducks and swans and everything can get through. This one has been funded. This was a disadvantaged communities grant. So from the overpass all the way almost to the town of Ronan has been funded. We just have this one section right here in front of 9 Pipes that's currently not funded, and we're applying for grants like crazy. The challenge being the turnaround time is really fast. And because the project languished for so long, there was no design. And so, luckily, because we have good partnerships with the state of Montana and the legislature in the last session allowed it, we can use different types of mechanisms to design and plan for projects. Previously, it took 5 to 10 years to design, budget, and fund and construct, design and budget for a project. That didn't even include construction. Now we're doing this green section in 2 years. They're using CMGC, contract management, CMGC, general contractor. And it's a way where we all come to the table at one time. The budget people, the contractors themselves, the engineers, the tribes, and we're all designing and planning this project out in a year so that the funds are obligated next year so that it can be built. I don't think the department loves to do projects that way. It's very rushed, but that's how we keep the money and that's how we get this done. So we've all committed to really being available to each other to get that done. So we've got 2025 as a let date for this section. For this orange and blue one, 2026. So we're just like back to back, just working really hard together to get all that designed and ready to go. People for many years have called me and said, how do we get projects like this funded for our areas? And the hard thing for me to say is the reason we have it is because it's in our treaty, because we're a tribe, because we push back and we have the political will and loophole to get in there and do that. So it's not always easy for me to say, how does another community do this? How does another tribe do this? One, for tribes, I say push hard, get to know your Federal Highway Administration tribal liaison and get those things going. But for places that are this, Highway 2 is sort of partially on the reservation. So I think writing your state and federal representatives is a big thing. Highway connectivity, road ecology, roads and wildlife are really a big part of the national conversation now. And so writing to those people and letting them know you want that in your area, I think has clout, and I think it has potential to get things done. Fostering relationships with your DOT folks, they're here, they're out there, they're picking up wildlife, and a lot of times they're driving the highways too. Trying to make connections with those folks is important, as well as the Federal Highway Administration. They have an office in Helena, they're here, they're friendly people. And the Federal Department of Transportation, writing letters, they're online. You can just cold email them and somebody has to address your comment. This is an interesting one because a lot of times people would call me and say, I would like to donate $100 to the highway project. And I would say, I would love to take your money for the highway project, but it's not going to go anywhere because the millions of dollars that are needed, that's a drop in the bucket. However, lots of hundreds of dollars might make something. And so we've talked to the Department of Transportation about this. And previously they had no way of taking donations in. They still don't. They don't have a way of taking donations in. That's something that needs to continue, and they need to keep working on that because that's an avenue for building up campaigns. Snoqualmie Pass in Washington, I was looking up videos last night. That is an amazing story of a community-led project, and I encourage you to Google it and look it up. There's really great videos about it, and it was a lot of grassroots and people saying we need these structures and working really hard to rally the public, rally their state legislators to get that project done. Granted, Seattle has a huge population base that Montana doesn't have, but we have a lot of people driving through, and they might really like to contribute to something if they knew how to do that. So I think continuing some of that grassroots, trying to contact your legislators and talk about getting a way for MDT to be able to accept donations and build up for that, I think is an important thing. And just having diverse partners, being able to engage your group, the Blackfeet tribe, all the people that care about this corridor, the USGS, the Park Service, all of that, getting everybody together at the table, which I think is something that's probably already in the works, is a way to keep moving those types of projects forward. And then lastly, because I was so excited because Pete came and visited us this spring. He came! I planned this whole thing. And yeah, I was so excited, so I had to put our picture on there because he came and looked at the crossing structure and recorded a little video that I've yet to be able to get a copy of. But it's important, Federal Department of Transportation, they need to know, and I believe that they actually even funded some work in Browning on the city streets, is what I heard. So they are trying to do work in the state of Montana. And I threw this in because when I think about aquatic invasive species spread, highways are a big connection and a big part of that. And the fact that all those boats are coming up and down those highways, we really need the DOTs to have a little bit more stake in this, because places where we can pull off big boats and stuff are often Department of Transportation parking areas. And I just want to throw that out there because when we think about highways, we should think about all the aquatic and non-aquatic invasive species that travel up and down highways. That is it. Yep. John.
Hi, Whisper. John Weaver here. So I live on the 5-acre Indian reservation along Mission Creek, where my ranch is. And I indirectly seen wildlife crossing under the bridge, and I have grizzly bears on my ranch. What I want to say is, I'm just in awe of the leadership that you and the tribe provided for this area. It's one of the most remarkable conservation achievements anywhere in North America. My question for you is, in this area here, where there's a railroad parallel to the highway,
Yep.
Things become complicated in a hurry.
Yep.
I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about how one might approach getting effective, efficient, easy process in a railroad highway complex.
I think that's a really big part of that, and I should have thrown something about getting partnerships with your railroad company, because we weren't able to get there on the Flathead Reservation. Our crossing structures get through the highway and dump right out into the railroad. And so it's a challenge. They did not want to engage at that time. They said, don't tell us what to do on our property. And it was a frustration, because like, we're doing all this really great stuff. We're increasing habitat, planting vegetation just to get them onto the railroad. Some of that section on the Flathead Reservation is still an active railroad corridor. Some of it has been abandoned over time. I attended some meetings in Glacier with some folks that are probably going to start partnering with you guys. I think there's been conversations with people, and it was before COVID, so that's why I think it kind of fizzled out. But at that time, there was a lady at the table, and we were introducing ourselves, and she was the environmental scientist for the railroad. And I probably offended her, but I was so shocked. I said, excuse me, you work for the railroad? And she's like, yes. I said, you're their environmental person? She said, yes. I said, I didn't even know you existed. Thank you for coming. So they do have staff. And however you can make a relationship with those folks, I think is an important part. This railroad has been such a sensitive area. You got grizzly bears getting hit. I'm sure the thing that we have is deer carcasses and eagles landing and trying to get those off the railroad. I'm sure that's an issue here. You have such a well-used railroad corridor that it's already in their minds and they understand. So hopefully they will continue to come and be part of that conversation. Field trips, hopefully they're good people that want to steward that type of project forward. I think just engaging them every step of the way and keeping them at the table is what I anticipate may be a way to get them to open up their hearts and minds to being able to do both of those things for wildlife and for safety of people and for their investment of their trains and the PR. Yes.
Speaking of railroads, how did the Canadians up in the Canadian Parks area deal with the Canadian Railroad and the Trans-Canada Highway? I know they've done amazing, I mean, that was the North American model.
Yep.
Did they get more cooperation from the Canadian railroad companies?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. We should probably get some connection with the people that were shepherding that previously. Maybe I can't imagine the mindset of the railroad companies differs between the two countries, but maybe there is a difference. I don't know. But that would be a good part of that history and that question to find out how that actually worked up there. And did it totally? I don't know. Yep.
It seems like Glacier National Park could be a huge monetary engine. So many people care when they get here, they see the animals, they're in love with this.
Yep.
It just seems like if there were a campaign that be coordinated with the park to raise money for these structures, that might be something that
The park may be the facilitator of that, but then it comes to the Department of Transportation who's building it, and if they don't have a way to take that money, I mean, I'm sure they would love to have it. They just need to get to the point where they can take it. So even if the park is being the entity that's generating the funding because of all their connections, if the DOT can't accept the money, then what do we do there? I had some folks call me from Washington, some wildlife biologists also received one of those wildlife crossing structure pilot project grants, and they needed to build an overpass on some private property. And they said, well, how did you work on that? And I said, you got this grant and you don't already have a partnership with the folks whose property it is? And they said, no, we got to work on that. I was like, oh, you better hurry because you only have so much time to get this money on the ground. And so being able to make those partnerships up front before you start getting the money is one of the, I think, important elements. Because sometimes it's a quick turnaround. Yep, you're here.
Well, I don't have a question, but I'd like to thank you for a wonderful presentation. And what you folks are doing should make the state of Montana hang their head in shame. I shouldn't say that, but that's what I feel. You guys are light years in front of our state. And that's Glacier-Two Medicine Alliance. I'm part of it. We're trying to work on some connectivity corridors on Highway 2, but it takes a lot of cooperation. And I just hope that a lot of people here will get our message, what we're doing, and step forward and help us out. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I think that's an important part because I came into the highway project after all the screaming and shouting and rudeness was over. So that didn't start out easy. That didn't start out nice. It started out as, you don't know how to build highways, don't tell us what to do. And us saying, this is our property, it's our land, don't just wreck it. And it was screaming and yelling. And by the time I got there, the personalities in the room had changed. Sometimes it's the people in the room have to change to get things to go forward. And we had gotten to that place, the right people were in place, things moved forward. But over time, then people get back in place that don't believe in them. I remember walking out of a meeting in Missoula one time. We were talking about Highway 200, where the adventure cyclists had been, scientists had been. And as I had my back to him, I was walking out and he said, now whisper, don't be trying to put a bunch of highway crossing structures on that project or we'll be here for another 20 years. And I stopped. I was shocked. I didn't want my face to show it, so I shook it off and I turned around and I said, well, we're going to have to do what we're going to have to do, no matter how long it takes. And I gathered my stuff and went outside and I was like, oh my gosh, I thought we were past that. I thought we'd gotten past that, but we haven't with everybody. And there's just a lot of changes in people and it makes it a little bit challenging. So hopefully the right people can be in place at the right time to keep this project moving forward. Had somebody right here? Go ahead.
In the early part of your talk, you talked about land ownership. And did I hear you right when you said at this point we're up to 62%?
Yeah, I think it's 63% land ownership for tribal land.
And does that include tribal land as a whole plus individually allotted land?
Yes. So when people have individually allotted land that is held in trust for them, so in this stage, and it's probably a reason because of people getting rid of their deeds to their lands in the back, a tribal member having an allotment doesn't fully own that title to that land. It's held in trust by the federal government. And so in order, if I had an allotment and I wanted to try to sell it, I would have to ask the tribes if they were willing to let that property go. And then we would have to ask the BIA. And if both of those entities release that land, then I could sell it. But generally, they don't release the land. I own property on fee land, so I don't own tribal land, I own non-tribal land. So sort of it's tribal land. But yeah, there's a lot of those intricacies there. And I think some of that was put in place to stop.
And what was the point, what was the numbers where non-Indians own the most land on the reservation?
I don't think I have, but after that first homesteading, I would almost say that was flipped. It was probably 63% or more non-tribal land to tribal land. And we've had to buy it back a lot of times, and that's what we do. We have a budget annually to purchase land, but post-COVID, property prices are so high, it eats up that budget like that. If you can even get it, things have cooled, but people were buying, probably the same here, people were buying property off the internet. They didn't even like come and look at it, they're just buying it up. So we really went through a challenging time. I believe there was an increase of 10,000 residents from 2020 to 22. We couldn't even register our vehicles at the courthouse without an appointment, and you could only register so many vehicles per day because people were coming in with 10 vehicles to register at a time. I don't know what you got, but that's a lot of vehicles. Oh, yep, right here really quick.
Yeah. Thank you. Nice talk, great talk. The squeaking wheel will get the grease. How about buying a few shares of Berkshire Hathaway or BNSF railroad line and go to an annual meeting and raise hell?
I think that's probably a really good idea. Yeah, it gets it in everybody's minds.
Before Warren Buffett croaks.
Right? I think that's a good point. Yep.
I just met with a group of young people last Saturday that had been on that reservation talking to Jermaine White.
Mm-hmm.
And she told them that, you have gotten a lot of the land back, but the problem now is the voting block is still mostly non-tribal members that live there, so they're still making the decisions.
That's totally right.
Yeah.
I just had that conversation with somebody yesterday. Yesterday before I came over here. Engaging people to vote is a challenge, and if you don't vote, then people who have ideas different than you get to make the decisions about your living situation. So we really try to push tribal members, young people to vote. There's different feelings about it. I went to jury duty one time and somebody said, I don't know why I'm here. I don't even register to vote, so you can't call me for jury duty. And I was thinking, oh no, here's another block. Here's something where people don't realize, one, as a tribal member, you should be able to face a jury of your peers. So why are we avoiding jury duty? And two, that's not where they get all of it. Sometimes it's just yours. Yeah. Yes.
You're really wise in terms of urging all of us to keep the conversations going in as many places as you can, because there is an effort to expand passenger rail in this country and in our area.
Yeah.
And those efforts are going to bring money to the table and people to the table that haven't been there before, that is a forum for conversations to getting wildlife crossings across both roads and railroads at the same time.
Yep.
And the BNSF wants the federal money to improve their western rail lines now. And we have a new Amtrak board member from the west for the very first time. And we have other avenues of conversation. The Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority is very interested in this. We can get this done if we start the conversations as you advise.
I think that's totally right. That's great. Are you trying to shut me down?
No, I'm not. I want to keep questioning this. I'm trying to write what Dan said down, because that's a really novel avenue that I haven't heard mentioned before in this conversation. So Dan, if I forget to circle back with you at some time, ping me after this weekend is over. Thank you. But Whisper, thank you so much for coming. I'm just so grateful that you were here, and as others have said, for the work that CSKT is leading across the Flat Indian Reservation. I know one of the key concerns, I mean, there's lots of species that we're concerned about, but one of them has been grizzly bears. And I'm curious if you could just share, either with grizzly bears or if there's other focal species, what you've seen in terms of changes, either in movement or decreases or changes in mortality as a result of these structures for getting them across the highway.
Yep, so grizzly bears are an important part in the Mission Valley. A lot of grizzly bear movement across the landscape from the Mission Mountains in the east to the west. And they have been getting to the Flathead River and have actually swam the Flathead River. And even though it's controversial, we would love for them to disperse down into the Selway Bitterroot and over into the Selkirks and keep on going over to Idaho. But because the section that hasn't been reconstructed is still there, we still have a pretty high grizzly bear mortality. And when I first started working on this project, the allowable take for grizzly bears associated with the permit for the highway reconstruction was 2 dead grizzly bears in a 10-year period. We got right up to it, and then we didn't have any grizzly bears hit for 3 or 4 years, and so then it went away, and then all of a sudden we had 8 hit in 1 year. And so now we're exceeding the allowable take, and we engaged everybody. The Fish and Wildlife Service came on, and I was like, oh my gosh, here we go. Road construction's gonna start, we're on our way. And all it did was trigger another environmental impact statement and another allowable take statement. And at this point, then they said, well, maybe you can have a moving target of 6 grizzly bears dead over any sort of consecutive years. And we said 6 in 6 years, that's our new level. So if we have 1 and then 2 years and then 1, that resets that 6. It's not 2 in a consecutive year. So then we argued, well, female grizzly bears have a far more sensitivity to the population than male grizzly bears because we're hitting females. And so then it's 4 females in a 4 consecutive years of grizzly bears, and males are 6. And it was frustrating because it didn't do anything. We have a lot of people looking at those numbers and making statements, but hopefully with us actually having the money to start working in that area, then we can see that change. Because right now, the area where the grizzly bears are moving has not been mitigated. They'll walk around a fence end. I showed grizzlies walking through that underpass, but the females with cubs will go away from there and around the fence end. So we haven't seen the results yet because the mitigation's not the right place. Any more before I let you get onto your words? Yep, and then we got one back there, and I'll really stop.
I just have a quick one.
Yep.
No, outstanding. I'm always so grateful whenever I get to hear you speak, which is never enough. And always tell people that this is a national model that people should be following and learning about. So it's really a big gift to get to hear this and see all the pictures today. Could you just sort of throw out some of the numbers of how much it costs to do all this work with all these grants? Because you guys have been hitting it over the back fence, and it's just an amazing amount of money.
Yeah, it's not cheap. I think that our overpass project was around 8 million. I think this NSFLTP is 32 million. We had asked for 64, which was the cap that year, and that would have taken us up to here if we would have got the full 64 million, but they only funded half of it, so we didn't get the whole thing completed. So that's 32 million, 8 million. I haven't been as engaged as with this one as much. My guess is probably around the same level, around the $30+ million to get that one reconstructed. And that includes those wider shoulders, wider lanes, crossing structures where necessary. We're having to come back in and talk about fencing separately because the construction for these projects didn't allow for those mitigation measures. So then we have to have the DOT be their good partners and come in and build the fence. So that's still part of the conversation. There is match required. The state DOT does have to contribute something to this one, not to this one. No match on this one. So there's match here and there's match here, and they have agreed. And we're actually, because the tribes don't build highways, the DOT builds highways. So we, through the Federal Highway Administration, have worked it so that those grants get turned over to the state of Montana. We have negotiated that we are part of the conversation. They don't leave us out anyway, but that we solidified that in those agreements, and then they get the money to build the highway. Yep.
You said the crossing structure budget was 8 million. How much would it have cost for the design you preferred?
I think it was 8 million for that one back then. And that was 2 years ago. So we applied for that grant 2 years ago with that $8 million level. You know, it's probably 10 million now every year we go past. So we'll see how we make that work, whether we have to change the design to fit into that amount or whether the DOT comes up with the rest of the money. That's one of our challenges. It was 8 million for the design version. Go ahead. You guys tell me to stop and I'll stop, or I'll keep going.
Obviously, one of the reasons for wanting the connectivity is to maintain genetic connectivity
Yep.
across transportation corridors. Have you been able to gather any data that would indicate that the crossing structures have helped maintain genetic connectivity and demographic connectivity, or is it the period of time not long enough yet to measure those types of parameters?
We haven't done any genetic testing at this time, so mainly it's pure numbers and just that movement. And when we talk about climate change and things like that, we definitely use those crossing structures as part of the tribe's commitment to addressing climate change, because being able to move animals across the landscape is the best thing we can do, because we're not going to be able to restore those populations or recreate habitats. We need to be able to just let them move and live as they can. So we don't have any genetic studies. Again, with the grizzly bears, if we can start to see some changes after those final mitigations are put in place, then maybe. I think one of the saddest stories was we had a 24-year-old female hit in the Nine Pipes area at 4 a.m. by an ambulance. So she was an old female. She had lots of babies that were in part of the genetic study from up in Glacier, and they had all the information about her and her progeny. And an emergency vehicle at 4 a.m, and she's just walking across the landscape in the dark, and they just happen to take her out. And that's just sad, because they're just walking across the landscape. They don't see anything. It's dark. And an ambulance. Oh yeah, I have the picture. It was totally smashed. People didn't get hurt more. They were able to get everybody to the hospital and everything was okay. But that's another resource for the county that's gone. Ambulances, I'm sure, aren't cheap. Yes, ma'am. Yes, last question. Yes.
Earlier this summer, I went to a American Speak program in the park where Dr. Vernon Finley spoke. Is he Salish or Kootenai?
He is Kootenai. Wait, no, I think he's both. And he actually has some language that he speaks in both. So I think Vernon is both, but he is the director of the Kootenai or the Kasenka Culture Committee.
Doesn't the reservation have the first tribally designated wilderness?
Yep, we sure do. And that was, again, tribal, oh, it'll take me so long to get back to it. Tribal member pushed for that. And we wanted federal designation. We weren't able to get it, but you know, the BIA let us designate it as a tribal wilderness, and we protect that. Fire is allowed to burn in there as it comes up. We have reductions of the number of people that can be in that area, and we created that grizzly bear management area to keep people out of the Army cutworm moth area. Though we just looked at that, and it seems that less bears are going up for Army cutworm moths these days.
Dr. Finley indicated that he wasn't in favor of wilderness. So I wondered how much controversy there was within tribes when that was designated.
I think the controversy was that, you know, logging and generating revenue was a big deal back then, as it is always. And so it was those yayas, those grandmas that came forward and said, no, you need to listen to us, and we're not leaving until you listen to us, tribal council, and make some changes in your land management. And they did. I don't know what other controversy there was, and I'm not sure why Dr. Finley is against wilderness areas, but for the overall protection of that resource, I think it's been a positive thing in my opinion.